Thank you for joining me this morning, and welcome to the bar's response to the 2020 pandemic project, sponsored by the Historical Society of the New York Courts and the Young Lawyers Committee. This morning we have Stephen Younger with us from Patterson, Belknap, Webb, and Tyler. My name is Danielle Quinn. I am the chair of the Young Lawyers Committee of the Historical Society of the New York Courts. And the purpose of this project is really to capture attorneys across New York State's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as record their practices as far as with respect to the court's reopening. So Steve, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our followers and listeners. Specifically, let's talk a little bit about your partnership at Patterson and your role on the board here.
Well, first, thank you, Danielle, for all your efforts in spearheading this. So I am what I call a lifer. I've been at Patterson Belknap, believe it or not, since 1985, after I clerked on the New York Court of Appeals, which was an extraordinary experience in my life. I had the privilege of leading the bar as its president after another crisis, 2009, which is starting to seem like it was a little small event compared to what we're going through now. I've been involved in the society since it was formed by Chief Judge Kaye, who was a role model for so many of us, and became chair in the last year of the board, and have really felt that this project is something that, one, will help us capture history, but two, help us connect with lawyers across the state. So I'm very pleased that you, Danielle, have taken such a strong role in doing this for us.
Yeah, so can we just talk a little bit about where the idea for the project started and a little bit about who we're working with on this project?
Sure. So like most people, I fled New York City. Well, many of us didn't flee, but I fled New York City on March 12th. I know the date pretty well, and spent about a month spending time with my grandkids, doing the same amount of billable work, sort of, but not really connecting. And we did a project in April for the Society where we focused on the 1918 pandemic. And it was truly an extraordinary project because we brought together someone who had written the text on the pandemic, the general counsel of FEMA, and this webinar was watched by close to 900 people. And somehow a light went on in the attic, and it's funny how these things work, where, I said, gee, we had such little historical texts about what was happening. We should be recording what's going on as it happens. I lived through 9/11. I think there were some histories of 9/11. And obviously we've all seen documentaries about, the great fiscal recession in 2009. But today, everybody's walking around with an iPhone and some kind of camera. And so that was sort of the germ of the idea. As well, I've been fortunate to have, both through my alma mater law school, which we share, Danielle, and also through my work in the bar, friends all around the state. And so it's enabled us to have connections with lawyers all the way from Buffalo up to Glens Falls, down to Staten Island, and even out to Long Island. And so the idea really was to bring people together, even though we can't be together in person, but virtually, and share the kinds of experiences that we're all going through.
Yeah, now, Steve, you mentioned that you had left New York to go to Maine. We'll go back to sort of talking about other bar-related projects, but could you just tell me a little bit about your experience during, March and April of the pandemic, both personally and, practicing law from home?
Sure. So the first couple of months we were down in Maryland, where we have a small apartment near our grandkids. And as I said, the first month, I read a lot of books, watched too much CNN, and did, enough billable work, but wasn't really interacting. And so this light kind of went on in the attic that said, we have to start getting out there. And so I don't know how many seminars I've done, but I did one on COVID-19 commercial litigation that had 2,000 people. I've done a bunch with lawyers around the world that I've connected with, through Zoom. And we have a special project on our blog where we're following the impact of the pandemic on the commercial division. And so literally, I don't know how many posts, I mean, it's dozens of posts about, what's happened in the court system. But so I was working from our apartment down there, kind of close quarters. Everybody's been in close quarters. The benefit is I got to spend a lot more time with my grandkids, playing with trains and things like that. But I had very early on a Second Circuit argument and then a special master argument for a case in New York Supreme Court. Very different. The Second Circuit argument was telephonic, and which was quite difficult because you couldn't kind of make a connection with the judges, whereas the special master argument was by Zoom. And I felt like, the hard thing is lawyers cutting each other off and stuff like that. The special master handled it extremely well. And it kind of gave me the sense that you could do the practice of law despite this pandemic. And I started really kind of studying how the advocacy skills of us lawyers are different in this virtual environment. So flash forward, after 8 or 9 weeks, we came up here to Maine, where I've been coming my whole life, and I've been here since sort of mid-May. The biggest challenge, I think, is Wi-Fi, since I have one kid and a significant over here. I have another kid and a significant other over there, and we had grandkids and the parents for a while, and everybody wants to use Zoom, everyone wants to use the Wi-Fi. We just had a new cable come in. I've got a little hotspot that I sneak off to. But I think that's been one of the things that's been, most challenging for a lot of people is the technology of it. On the other hand, I think it's been a huge benefit. And I think long-term, this is going to affect us even, when we get back to some normalcy. I do a lot of international work, and I can't imagine if I say to a client, I'm going to get on a plane and go to Singapore just to see one witness, they're going to approve that. We can do a lot of this virtually. But on the other hand, I think many of us are yearning for that time when we can get back together, because there are things you just can't pick up when you do this virtually as opposed to in person.
And what are the in-person things that you can't pick up? For example, is it something like social cues or how responsive a judge might be to an argument? Are those types of things that you're talking about that are missing?
Yeah, I think the main thing is those kinds of cues. So one, you don't know if the joke is on you or among them, because sometimes people use humor. Two, you don't know if a question is posed really for you or for the other judges when you're talking about a panel of judges. Next, you can't always get their reaction. You're, with the Zoom features, you're always, or whatever virtual medium you're using, you're kind of focused on, very often yourself, which is wrong, but on one of the judges, where if you were live, you could get more of a kind of sense of the court. I think the biggest thing that I felt for my telephonic argument, if a judge is really pressing an issue, I would often kind of shift it to another judge who I think might be more sympathetic. It's impossible to do that on the telephone. You might be able to do that a little bit more virtually. But I think it's a challenging medium. I think the court system is doing the best it can because they do have this this virtual system up there, and they're keeping up with their arguments as a result. I found that the arguments were shorter, and it'd be interesting to know if that's a scientific finding or just me. So I think if you were live, you might have more time to kind of get into things and elaborate. But I think the key thing is you lose those body language cues. Now, I also do a lot of mediation work, and Zoom mediation has taken off. I mean, I have one friend in Texas who's doing one every single day. I talked to a colleague yesterday about one, and I think that is really going to take off long term. And I had been a skeptic. I always felt mediation had to be in person. You had to get that body language. But here's what we've learned. So often you have a mediation, and in the first 2-3 hours, it's not going to go anywhere. Yet you spent a phenomenal amount of money bringing people to one place. And I think what's going to happen more is you'll have, say, a 2 to 3 hour Zoom mediation, see if you can, make stuff happen, and then you'll use that as a predicate to getting together. I think that will be more of a model that we'll see. No, I think we'll also still see just pure in-person mediations, but the virtual platforms have been set up in a way so that you can move people into different, waiting rooms and move around, and it's been used with great facility. That was a surprise to me because I had always been a doubter. I was always a person that this is something that's got to be done in person, and I think that was a real wake up. I think the other thing is, I mentioned witness interviews, but for example, I do a lot of arbitration work. We've traditionally in arbitration had witnesses from video who were outside the jurisdiction. The interesting thing is whether the courts will do that more. It's less of a practice in the court system, but I think hopefully the courts will embrace this because it's a reality that we all face. I think one of the key things that I think will add to just greater efficiency in the court system is more video check-ins with conferences. We're all used to going down to court. We spend half an hour to get there. We wait around for half an hour, and by the time we're done, we spent 2-3 hours for 15-20 minutes with a judge. And I've seen, for example, the medical profession changing their practices, and I think hopefully long term this will be something that the court system will embrace. I know that in the commercial division they'd already started doing it, but now that we're used to these mechanisms, I hope that we'll have more virtual conferences with the courts, because I think it will save our clients a huge amount. And I think the courts are now much more comfortable with these forms of conferencing.
Absolutely. Now, it seems like you've had a broad range of experiences through different sort of digital mediums practicing before the courts. Is there anything that you did to prepare differently for this type of forum versus an in-person argument or presentation? And can you talk to me a little bit about your preparation process for your appellate arguments and your hearings?
What I found interesting, Danielle, was the preparation was almost exactly the same. And I still had my notebooks. I still read the same cases. I think two things were different. I couldn't just walk down the hall and see a colleague and bounce an idea off of. I had to get on the phone and find them. I couldn't get as ready access to something in the record, or I had the whole paper record, but something that needed. It's the administrative side of things that's more difficult. Let me just dig into an issue and find that last nugget. In terms of preparing, I actually did a mock preparation, not once, but twice, by the same medium as a court. And I really recommend it. I've always felt when you're using technology at a trial or a hearing, you got to practice it, you got to practice it again, because otherwise it interferes with your presentation. It's all about, the whatever didn't work,
Mm-hmm.
And, we're all deathly afraid that, one just funny story, my Second Circuit argument, they had a practice of saying, we're going to let you argue for 2 minutes, and then we're going to start asking questions. And I was kind of 2/3 of the way through the calendar. And at that point, they were asking questions senior to junior. I think they've stopped doing that. But so I get into 4 minutes, and nobody's asked me anything. I must be brilliant or something. I don't know. So I was panicked that I lost the connection. Because they were supposed to start asking questions after 2 minutes. So maybe, one of the judges decided to take a break or something. I don't know. So I literally had to stop myself and say, are there any questions? Because I knew that, they were supposed to start. And it was actually a nice little cue, because the judge presiding then said, let's start the questioning. But I was just nerve-wracked that I'd lost this connection. I was just talking to myself.
Volume was off.
That's the biggest fear we lawyers have, that the Wi-Fi is going to go down or something in the middle of this argument.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about working with clients during the pandemic. Have you experienced any difficulties connecting with clients while doing so in a socially distant virtual setting?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue is things that just don't translate. And I'll give a couple examples. Like, I'd sent a bill out to a client in March, bill wasn't paid. Then we had a Zoom and they said, oh yeah, that bill, we'll take care of it. Still wasn't paid. Well, there'd been a disconnect. They had expected the work to be A and B, and it became A, B, and C. Normally, we would have had a conversation. Actually, this client is right in our building. I would have just seen them. We would have talked about it. And so it was kind of under the surface until I kind of called them on it. It was, oh, that's the issue. We'll take care of it, And so I think, you have some of these kind of under the surface issues that don't, get brought to the fore as much. And some people are kind of reluctant to raise them. But I think the biggest challenge I had a new case where it was really hard to get underneath what was really going on. And it's foreign clients, so there were some language issues, but it really wasn't language. And question after question, and I'd be asking A, and I'd get an answer about C, and then you felt like, well, you have to go back and read the documents again, or ask for these more documents. And I just think if I was in the same room with them, look, a lot of the documents are in a foreign language, but I often, speak that language as well as I can, and usually have somebody who speaks it fluently. But that, to me, that's an example of, if you're in person, you take out a piece of paper, I show it to you, and we can kind of go back and forth and understand it. When it's just over a medium like this, it's much more difficult. And there are those things that are kind of lying underneath a dispute that you don't bring to the fore as quickly.
Okay. And, so eventually we will sort of return to the office and eventually maybe be able to see our clients in person. So I'm wondering, what your plans are for physical distancing in the future when we get to that point, what sort of social physical distancing you're engaging in now. If you could just talk to me a little bit about your experiences now and what you plan for the future with physical distancing.
So let me just start with what I'm doing right now. So I'm in this tiny little town that I've been coming to my whole life. So my best friends in the world are here. And we see each other, but we see each other differently. So someone comes over on the deck, they sit over there, we sit here, and you have a drink together, or you bring your own can of beer and I bring my own can of beer, and so already we're interacting in a way that's different than we would have. I mean, I went to a memorial service the other day. Wasn't at the church, it was in somebody's front yard. And everybody was wearing a mask, and everybody was very respectful of keeping distance from each other, because they knew a gathering could create issues. My son is having 3 friends up for the weekend. Each one of them got tested before they came. And we're planning to do things together, but we're all going to eat separately. And so I think most of us are adapting habits that we can interact with other people, and I think our governor has made this quite clear, it's not just about you infecting me, but I have to be respectful of me infecting you, right? And because, we just don't know, we just have to assume that everybody's carrying this disease. So in terms of the office, I think we've already put together some very well thought out plans in terms of the number of people that can be on a floor at a time, the ability of people to kind of walk around floor to floor. It basically kind of keeps people in place and monitors numbers of people. I think, to me, the biggest thing is commuting. So, being a New Yorker, it's a subway, right? And I just can't imagine, and this is one of the reasons I think I was taking the subway until like the week before. And I just think of all those people holding on to a subway pole that you've never met before in your life. And we just have always taken that for granted. But I've never kind of understood why everybody has to take the subway between 8 and 9:30, say, I think we're going to see more people going in at like 5:30 or 6 and other people going in at 10:30 or 11. I mean, it just doesn't, and by the way, I've been doing that myself for a while. I would, if I had early morning calls, taking them from my apartment and coming in at 10 or 10:30. But I just think we are going to become a flex time society. Parts of our society have done it already, mostly around issues like childcare. But I think that the flexibility of work arrangements, and I see that with my real estate clients, they're already figuring out different flexible environments. And I think that's going to be a long-term issue and something we probably should have adapted to a long time ago, because we all walk around with these things and are able to communicate and do our work, no matter where we are. So we didn't really have to be in a physical office from, say 9 o'clock to 7 or whatever it was that we did it for, but it was just habit. And I think those habits will break.
So we talked a little bit about the courts, obviously a lot about the courts. Do you see there being jury trials in the next month, 2 months, 3 months?
Danielle, I think that's the toughest question the court system has. So I did jury duty myself in the fall. I had no worries about being with people I'd never seen before. Whenever I do jury duty, I meet somebody. But I think a lot of people are going to be concerned about answering that summons. One, they'll be, the people that would answer it are going to be asking for excuses to get out, even more so than they usually do. But, unfortunately, there will be people ignoring the summonses. And as much as the court system tries, it's going to be a really difficult issue. I had a discussion with a judge the other day who felt there really wasn't going to be, real trials on the civil side, which is my area, before the end of the year. And I think the court system is going to try to be, pushing jury trials. Obviously, we're going to have bench trials. We have other mechanisms. You go to arbitration. But I have a lot of difficulty seeing actual jury trials. Now, on the other hand, on the criminal side, it's a much, much tougher issue. So, you can't really have felony indictments without a grand jury. And so I think the court system is going to have to, and they're already doing this, come up with systems to have grand jury proceedings during this pandemic. You also have to recognize there are people, sitting in jail waiting trial, and they have rights and need to be respected. So that's a very difficult issue. Another concern I have is the access of the public. Our courts are presumptively open to the public. And I know, for example, in the Second Circuit argument I had, the case behind me was being watched by the press. So they could dial in to this open number. But I just think it's harder for the public to access our proceedings when they're in this mode than if someone just walks into a courtroom or walks around the courthouse. And that's just a challenge that our court system is going to have. But look, in the end, it's about justice. And I think that the great story is that despite all these difficulties, justice is being delivered every day. And that's a testament to the leaders of our court system, the leaders of our bar, and to just lawyers and judges and court personnel who've all pulled together to make this work. And nothing's going to be perfect. We're all in the middle of challenges, but we're all doing the best we can. And I think we've learned so many lessons from this that will make us better lawyers and better professionals as a result.
Absolutely.
And I have a friend who's a doctor at a major hospital, and I called him about late April. I said, "What are your plans?" They've just been canceling flights. And he said, "Steve, they don't want you going back and forth because you're just going to be carrying, disease." Mm-hmm. My wife was more like, "Hey, I don't want you going back and forth because you may infect me."
Yeah.
And so right now I have no current plans to go back to the office until we obviously have some cure for this this terrible disease. I may have to go back if, say, a judge schedules a hearing or something like that. And personally, it's not a fear. I actually think that I probably had it in March because most people in New York City were around, New York City had it. And fortunately, I didn't have bad symptoms. Mm-hmm. But there's still something inside of me that says, I have a family, I've got, loved ones that don't want me to be exposed. And so I literally have no plans to go back until the world returns to a greater sense of normalcy. By the way, my house in Maine is not heated, so that will provide the end date, probably Columbus Day. Then and by the way, my apartment in the city, the front door hasn't even been opened since March 12th. And we turned off the Con Ed bill, turned everything off, the mail being forwarded. I miss it. I can't wait for the day when I can go back to my apartment. I love it. I'm someone who was born and raised in Manhattan, and it's under my skin. I just, it's inside of me. But there's also something inside of me that says I'm just not comfortable being there right now.
Yeah. And, so I want to ask you, what are the things that you think that you've experienced as an attorney and practicing in the New York State courts that you think should continue through? I know you talked a little bit about doing preliminary conferences, maybe at the Supreme Court, via telephone or virtually. Is there anything else, or is there any other type of court practice that you think is important and could be used down the road to sort of facilitate quicker access to the courts? And then anything else that you've sort of learned as a practitioner during this period that you think might be helpful for people to know?
Well, I think the number one thing is technology. So I've been a proponent of e-filing since, even though I said I didn't have a computer, I appreciate, I have a computer now, but I was one of the first proponents of e-filing. And unlike the federal courts, there were some challenges in the state courts because of the fact that, particularly outside of New York, the county clerks are separately elected. And through the bar, I've worked on a number of projects to accelerate e-filing. But I think that's one of the things that we have seen dramatically affect our court system during the pandemic. So one of the reasons it took a while to get the courts back open is they essentially had to build a whole portal for the non-e-file cases. From my perspective, there should be almost no non-e-file cases. Now, I know that's a little bit naive because we have people who are unrepresented, but most people who are unrepresented could still figure it out. I mean, they use ATM machines, right? And I think it actually would help people who are unrepresented if they could use other systems. But so I think we're going to see a greater use of e-filing, and I think that's going to be good for the court system long term. It's also been true on the appellate level. I for years have been saying, why are we filing so many copies of the record? Now, I know you clerked for Judge Danielle. I'm sure that your first instinct was not to go to the paper record, but to go to the electronic copy on your computer. Yet for some reason, we're still all filing like 15 copies, which the only people that benefited from were the printers, frankly, because it was just paper everywhere. And our appellate courts have come up with some really good rules to address and move to more of a digital system. Court of Appeals just announced this week that you can actually make paper filings again in person there, but they've kept the digital system, and I hope long-term that will stay. I think the second thing that we're going to see, and Chief Judge DiFiore was already, trying to push these efforts with her presumptive ADR program beforehand, but there are parts of our court system that are going to be hugely overloaded. So they were closed for 3 months, backlogs built up. Then we're seeing lots and lots of issues come out because of the pandemic, whether it's insurance issues, real estate, employment. Obviously, we had exponentially more people pass away, so our surrogates courts are really going to be overloaded. And then you have the issues of people of what I call poor people's lack of resource cases, our housing courts, or folks who can't get disability benefits or food stamps, or you name it. I mean, our communities of color have just been so hard hit. And where do they turn? They turn to the court system. So I think the big opportunity for the court system is to really embrace mediation. I can tell you, because it's an area I've been in for many, many years. California, Texas, Florida, they had always been the leaders. We use mediation a lot. and our court system has embraced it, but I think the court system will be embracing it even more because it will truly be, the answer for many of these cases. Because I mean, right now it's going to be extremely difficult to have a trial, and we all know 99% of cases don't go to trial anyway. But I think the use of more, mediation, actually sort of within the court system or outside, it can be either one, is going to be a major, trend that we will see coming out of this.
Okay, so in closing, well, first of all, is there anything that you think that our listeners or watchers should know, or do you have any advice sort of for practitioners practicing virtually, responding to the pandemic? Any sort of words of wisdom for those out there listening?
Well, the first thing is, what we're about. We're about history, and where I'll begin sort of where I began in the beginning, which is I personally learned a lot from the 1918 pandemic. One, I learned that it was much worse. 25 to 50 million people died. And so we have a lot more access to information today. So that was good news to me. Second, I learned that there were actually cases that we can learn from about how the courts addressed these issues following 1918 that we can learn from. So I would really encourage our listeners to go to our website, see the kinds of things that the Society does, because it can really help you inform your own practice and et cetera, because we lawyers all love history. We have a project right now about issues of race and how they've been dealt with in the courts. And I think that's something that everybody's really concerned about. But in terms of practice, we are an interpersonal problem-solving profession. And I think a lot of people that I talk to kind of say, well, I'm stuck in my attic, or I can't leave my apartment, or I can't meet somebody at Starbucks. You still can. And I've just found, you send somebody an email, send somebody a text, do you have 5 minutes to talk? People are happy to talk to other people. And whether it's virtually with a Zoom or something else, or it's just getting on a phone call. I just spent an hour with a young lawyer that I've mentored for a long time, because the ABA is meeting next week, and he's just gotten a big award, but just also talking to him about his career. And I know that, Danielle, you've been able to make relationships with folks in the Society there. They're a step ahead of you on what I call the journey of life. And I was very fortunate to have extraordinary mentors. And when I was a bar president, I made much of my presidency about mentorship. And you can still do that in this pandemic. And in fact, you can probably do it better because people are able to find time in different ways. I'm not scheduled for dinner 4 nights a week, or going out for lunches, or going to these different events. So it's about, finding people and finding ways to connect with other people. And frankly, that's what I think has been so helpful about this project. We've been able to, as I said earlier on, connect with lawyers around the state and have them really convene through the Society. And hopefully that will last in a longer term basis.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview and telling us about the project and your practice and all of the work that you've done across the state to connect attorneys. It was a pleasure, and I think it was a great interview. So thank you for joining us.
And thank you, Danielle, for spearheading this wonderful effort.